Hey, everybody, welcome. So, throughout the history of the United States, moral and religious values have been extremely important traditionally. The entire conversation before the Civil War about slavery was very, very biblically based. You can see this in Lincoln's second inaugural address and so forth. Obviously, Dr. King, during the Civil Rights Movement, he was a Baptist preacher. He spoke in religious and moral terms. Traditionally, the political right has been more interested in personal moral values, and the political left more interested in public moral values. When we look at what's happening in America today, when we look at this unbelievable demolition of our democratic freedoms, we're all asking ourselves, well, what are the forces behind all this? And many of us are absolutely appalled to see how much of that is coming from a force that is usually called Christian nationalism. And people are realizing that what this political force of Christian nationalism is something that has nothing to do necessarily with the teachings of Christ. And for that reason, many people, including my guest today, has said, we got to talk about this. We're not going to be quiet about this. We're not going to keep our heads down, because the antidote to this Christian nationalism that seems to have nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus, the antidote to that is people having a very vibrant and robust conversation about what the teachings of Jesus actually are in relation to public policy. We see this politically among such people as the Texas legislator James Tallarico. And my guest today is someone who, outside the electoral political sphere, but very much in the sphere of those who are talking about political issues, is the wonderful, the marvelous, and my friend, John Fugelsang. So, John, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's so nice to see you and to be with your incredible audience. Thank you for letting me drag your show down to my level once again.
You are very funny, so everybody sort of expect to be laughing.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
This
Normally, these books are written by theologians and clergy and people with credentials,
Yeah,
not
really.
a foul-mouthed vulgarian comedian with a Sirius XM show.
I
But
can't
thank you.
imagine that any of you actually don't know that side of John, but just in case you don't know his extraordinary career, let me tell you a few things. He is a Drama League nominated actor, comedian, and broadcaster who hosts the acclaimed Tell Me Everything series on Sirius XM Progress number 127. He has played for the troops overseas. Now, this is an interesting thing, which I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit about, but I'm always fascinated. He is the child of an ex-nun and an ex-Franciscan brother. Now, we're here today to talk about his latest book. It's called A Separation of Church and Hate, a sane person's guide to taking back the Bible from fundamentalists, fascists, and flock fleecing frauds. Welcome.
Amen. Thank you, Marianne.
John, you surround it all with jokes, and you surround it all with this kind of clever way you have of talking, but you're very, very serious. And that's clear also in this book. That's what makes you so unique.
Thank you.
And we're living at a time which I know you agree with me about this. This is, in terms of what's actually happening, this is no joke at all.
Correct.
And so the fact that you give us an opportunity to laugh while we're talking is a good thing. But the deeper conversation is something very, very important for our country.
Indeed.
So this is not a new conversation for you, of course. But I always want, for those who haven't heard it, would you go a little bit? I just find it fascinating about your mother and your father, and
course.
how in your upbringing the political and the spiritual and the religious all came together. So tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you. Of course, I'm here because two people once broke a promise to God. My mother was a nun. She entered the convent right out of high school. She grew up in the segregated South, and for her that was a way out of where she was. And they put her through nursing school, and they sent her off to work with lepers in the jungles of Malawi, Africa. So she went from
Wow.
segregated Virginia to Malawi. But before they sent her off to Africa, she was briefly stationed at Holy Family Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. My father grew up in Brooklyn during the Depression, and he became a Franciscan brother. He wore the brown robes and the rope belt and looked like a Jedi Knight, and taught history to Catholic boys at St. Francis Prep. My father, the brother, met my mother, the sister, when he had TV and entered the hospital and fell madly in love with this nun in a habit with a Southern accent that he knew he wasn't allowed to be in love with. So they became very close friends. He became her pen pal and wrote her long letters every week about everything happening back in the States with civil rights. And eventually, after 10 years, it's a long story, but eventually, after 10 years, he convinced her to quit the convent and go on a date. And they tried to raise us to be progressive, free-thinking, sexually repressed Catholics, which is why I do comedy, because I can't afford the therapy I need. And like many, I grew up believing that Christianity was a religion about service, a religion about service, servant leadership, that it was about empathy and love and forgiveness, loving your enemies, turning the other cheek, doing the things Jesus commands, which are welcoming the stranger and caring for the poor and caring for the sick, individuals and nations on a policy level, as in Matthew 25. I grew up thinking that that's what Christianity is. And like so many who grew up in the 80s or 90s, I'd watch the TV news and I'd see these Christian leaders on cable news every night, men like Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart and Pat Robertson, and they were introduced as Christian leaders, but they didn't talk about anything that Jesus in the Bible I knew talked about. They were talking about welfare queens and the danger of AIDS patients and how poor people are lazy. These were people who got more angry about protests against racism than actual racism itself. And so many have grown up to know that this religion of love has been hijacked by a mean little clique that's tax-free and that doesn't actually follow the things the Nazarene in the Bible talks about. So for years I've done material about it, I've done stand-up, I've talked about it on the radio, on TV, and Marianne, everywhere I've gone, including the Sister Giant event in 2017, which was wonderful, but everywhere I've gone I've met so many folks who've had a similar story. And they grew up to think, what is this religion? Why is this priest screaming at me about transgender people? What about welcome the stranger? Why are they persecuting immigrants? This meanness in Christianity that has been well documented by so many, that has always existed here in a certain strain. And I came to feel that, you know, they say the largest growing religious group in this country are Mormons. Some say it's Islam. Some say it's none of the aboves. But I've come to believe it's people who were raised religious and now consider themselves spiritual because they're so turned off to all the hypocrisy and cruelty. So I wrote this book as a guide for anyone of any faith, atheist, agnostic, any religion, even conservative Christian friends, who's going to have to deal with a hater Christian, a fundamentalist or a right-wing Christian nationalist. And it's about all the topics that divide us and how they're against the teachings of Jesus on pretty much every one. And even if you're agnostic, if you're having a big political debate about important social issues with a Christian nationalist, chances are Jesus probably has your back. And I don't have any illusions about converting these people, but I wanted to let everyone else know you're not crazy. They don't fight for the things Jesus talked about. Here's the history of the religion. Here's what it started out as. Here's what it turned into. Here's why it's still worth fighting for. And here's what Jesus actually said on every issue.
I think it's important that we honor some of the nuances here. There are many people who are sincere, quote unquote, conservative
Amen.
Christians
Absolutely.
who do not fall into the mean-spirited camp.
Correct. That's why I made the whole book about hate, not about conservatives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so we want to be really clear about that. And also with what you're saying, the specific politicalization of this crowd you're talking about. And it did start with people like Jerry Falwell, remember, and the whole thing with the moral majority and all of that. So they began to be politicized several decades ago. Now, what we're dealing with today, of course, is not just people that, as you just said, are not even talking about Jesus. Unfortunately, they are talking about the U.S. government in ways that are not only religiously contrary to the teachings of Jesus, but are even contrary to the words of the U.S. Constitution and the
Correct.
founders. And of course, the one that comes most to my mind right now, and that is Mike Johnson. I find
Yes.
him very scary.
Indeed.
Because, like, where did he come from? And I think I know where he came from. That was a plant of sorts. He is definitely an example of the Christian nationalist who is
Yes.
specifically in power within our political system
Yes.
to not just it's not, once again, it's not just a perversion of the teachings of Christ, it's the perversion of the U.S. Constitution.
Correct.
When did you begin to see that this, specifically the Christian nationalists, not just a conservative Christian, conservative Christians are I
I
believe
love
in.
many conservative Christians.
Absolutely. And I believe many conservative Christians are very sincere
Yes.
about the teachings of Christ. And many conservative Christians are also very respectful of the U.S. Constitution
Yes,
and
they
so
are.
forth. So I think
Yes, they
that's really
are.
important. But this unique and uniquely peculiar political force of Christian nationalism that is so behind Project 2025, that is so behind the idea of suppression of women, that is so behind some of the stuff that is truly scary right now.
Yes.
When did you begin to see this, John? And what do you see as how did this happen? Because this was not just Jerry Falwell and those guys, or was it a natural progression from them? How do
Well,
you see this?
there's two ways to look at it. There's the long view, and there's the more recent decades. The long
Okay.
view, that this all began when, when they killed off the apostles, and Paul got to write the Bible, and Paul's version stuck, and Rome took over and began persecuting heretics, and that began the process of Christians going from a persecuted minority to then being a persecuting empire. And that led to the doctrine of, Spanish Inquisition, Crusades, doctrine of discovery, American slavery, segregation brought
The
us right here.
Calvinists, the
Yes,
Calvinists,
and
very
throughout all
definitely the
these
Calvin.
and throughout all these phases in history, Marianne, it was Christians fighting for the most cruel, inhumane policies, and every time, Christ followers opposed them. Christians fought to slaughter Muslims and Jews in the Crusades. Christ followers, like St. Francis, quit the war and preached peace. It was Christians like Columbus who slaughtered the indigenous, and it was Christ followers like the priest on his boat, Bartolomeo de las Casas, who protested to the Queen. All throughout history, every time you see authoritarian Christianity hurting and abusing people, there have always been sincere people of faith and their allies who have pushed back through civil rights. We've seen in our lifetime how many folks have talked their grandparents and parents out of so much homophobia in the last 30 years. And go ahead, please.
First of all, there's a lot of historical scuttlebutt right now. We're just
Okay.
learning exactly who Columbus was. I mean, Columbus also saved a lot of people from Isabella when he took them out of the Inquisition. When he rescued them from the Inquisition, went to places like the Caribbean. Many of them were Jews, for instance. So I think
Yes.
we're just beginning to learn some of the stuff about him specifically.
Sure.
But I think you're making a distinction.
But we already know a lot of things about what he did and the
That
human
we're
rights
not with the
abuses
American Indians and
in the
so
shadow
forth.
in the shadow of the cross, all of it.
So this is very important, the distinction you're making. You're making a distinction between the Christian religion and what you call the followers of Christ, which I, as a student of A Course in Miracles, particularly can fully appreciate.
Yes.
Because the Course is a very Christ-centered teaching, but it is not a religion.
Amen.
And it is people from all religions and no religions are students of the Course in Miracles. So I totally understand how someone can take the teachings of Christ as really core to your worldview and to your sense of purpose on the earth and not consider yourself a Christian. And what you're talking about there is so important in terms of the distinction.
Thank you.
Now, I grew up at a time, of course, when I was a teenager and even at the end of high school and the protests against the Vietnam War and so forth, the Catholic Berrigan brothers were a major moral voice.
Yes.
William Sloane Coffin.
Yes.
So when I was growing up, religious voices, genuine religious voices, and that included Jews and it included Catholics and it included Protestants, were very much a part of what we think of today as progressive politics and what we think of today as really taking a stand within the public space for policies that were that adhered to
Yes.
what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. So you've given us the long view. Now give us the short view. So the long view, you went all the way back.
The long view I could do all day. The shorter view,
Okay.
when Roe v. Wade was established by the Supreme Court, the most controversial thing about it was how not controversial it was. It was viewed as a Catholic thing. The Southern Baptist Convention continued to support a woman's right to reproductive freedom a year after Roe was signed. It was not until 5 years after Roe that Jerry Falwell ever mentioned abortion in a sermon for the first time.
Really?
Ronald Reagan, when he ran for president the first time, he was not making criminalizing abortion the main focus of his campaign. Reagan had signed the most liberal abortion law in California's history as governor in '66. In '80, he began with the anti-abortion movement, but the main issue that the Christian right was focusing on in the '70s, after they had failed on segregation, voting rights, Nixon was gone, was tax-exempt status for universities and schools that still practiced racial segregation. Jerry Falwell had opened a whites-only school himself. And if you'll look at Reagan's speeches in the 80s, he talks about Jimmy Carter's IRS going after our schools a lot more than he talks about abortion rights. But in the early 1980s, abortion became the central mission of the Christian right, the moral majority, the Republican Party, criminalizing abortion, which the Bible never calls for. Jesus is against the death penalty, but the Bible never actually bans it. And that wound up being the great achievement of the Christian right. We've now had 2 generations of American Christians who've been raised and groomed to vote against everything Christ talked about, all in favor of criminalizing abortion, which Christ never talked about. And it worked. And to this point, I often, when I'm hosting my SiriusXM show, I ask our right-wing callers to please give me one actual teaching of Jesus that the Republican Party has fought for in the last 40 years, something he actually said. And it's a great way to find out how many of our right-wing friends don't actually know the Bible. And the truth is, a lot of them don't know this book they wave around like a prop, and they're counting on you not knowing this book very well either. I don't think we have to hate them. We should never hate them, even the cruelest of fundamentalists. But it's time to take the Bible back from the creeps, because they've been using it as this cloaking device for hate for far too long, and you don't need to believe in every word of the Bible as literal fact to be able to use it to push back against cruelty in the name of a Jesus who forbids such cruelty.
Okay, now let's go back to this abortion issue. I'm certainly pro-choice, 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 pro-choice. I do believe, however, that there are many sincere Christians, and I'm not talking about the creeps that you're discussing. I'm not talking about people who are really, it's a cover for really suppressing women, I think, for many, and a kind of war on women. Those people exist, but I have met many, many sincere Christians for whom their
Me too.
advocacy for the repeal of Roe v. Wade was based on a sincere spiritual and religious conviction.
Right.
And I have always felt that it was, I mentioned when we started here today, what I consider to be the kind of over-secularization of the progressive conversation. And I've always felt that one of the reasons that we have lost so many Americans on the topic of abortion is because we have, some within our ranks have been so averse to even considering the possibility that it is a moral issue. You know, when I talked earlier about the fact that people on the right have traditionally been more involved with issues of personal morality, people on the left more involved with issues of public morality. I can't tell you how many times, and I've certainly traveled this country having run twice, so many people, this is the conversation I've had. I have said to so many people, I do understand your deep moral conviction around this. I do believe it's a moral issue, but I don't believe it's a moral issue for the government to decide.
Correct.
I believe it's a moral issue between a woman and her conscience, her God. I believe that some women, they are contextualizing it within what they believe the moral thing is to do with their life circumstances. I just don't think it's an issue that the government should be weighing in on. And I can't tell you, John, how many people have said to me, okay, but you do get that it's a moral issue, right? You do get that it's a moral issue.
Yeah, I get that.
And I'll say, absolutely, I got that. And they said, oh, okay. Right. And then they say, well, I can vote for you, even though I disagree with you on that issue, because I see where you're coming from.
Yes.
And I feel that so many times on that abortion issue, one of the reasons we lost it was because the left became about abortion the way the right is about guns. You can't have any conversation. We can't have anything, any of the slightest conversation to actually see the juxtaposition of factors here they consider a slippery slope. And I think so many times the people on the left have been afraid that bringing any kind of moral questioning into a political conversation would actually hurt a progressive cause. And I think in time and in situation after situation, it actually fosters a progressive belief. I think it's a moral issue that you don't invade a country that didn't do anything to you. I think economic justice is a moral issue. I think poverty is a moral issue. So if I understand you correctly, and I think I do, I've listened to you, I've read you a long time, what you're saying is that we need to reclaim within progressive politics not only the teachings of Christ, but the universal teachings of all the great religious and spiritual traditions of the world.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think the Democratic Party and the left in general have ceded
That's
spirituality
right.
to the right as
Yeah.
they have ceded the cross. I don't believe we have an abortion problem. I think we have an unwanted pregnancy problem with an abortion symptom. And I think Democrats need to find better talking points because I don't think government has the right to force citizens to be pregnant against their will. I don't think men have the right to force 14-year-old rape victims to be pregnant by their stepdad against their will. I don't think big government should have this power over us, and we have witnessed the shocking rise all throughout the South, especially in Texas, of infant mortality rates. Now that they've gotten their golden goose and taken away women's reproductive freedoms, we see, oh, a lot of those old pro-choice arguments really did make sense. It really did save lives. My issue when it comes to abortion is I'll completely respect anyone who thinks it's taking a life, and I'll hear you out, and I will understand where you're coming from. When you claim you're doing it because of Christianity, that's when I have to say respectfully that the Bible is not against abortion. Christ did ban the death penalty more than once. He
Yeah,
never
absolutely.
once mentioned abortion. My question is, if you support the death penalty, which Jesus specifically banned, but you're going to try to criminalize abortion, which Jesus never mentioned, go for it. It's a free society. Please don't claim your crusade is of Christ.
I'm concerned about the role that Christian nationalism is playing in the fostering of Project 2025,
Me
in the
too.
support of Donald Trump, and the dismantling of our democratic freedoms.
Yes.
That's the connection that I think many people are trying to put together in our minds. My daughter, in school, her higher education was around a lot around what happened when Henry VIII got rid of Catholicism and established the Church of England, closed the monasteries, and so forth. And how with Protestantism there was introduced this idea, whereas in Catholicism there had been this giving aid to the poor, giving aid to the poor. Within Protestantism there was a strain that was then evident within Calvinism, which was so there at the beginning of our country, and which today is so full blown, which has led to the demonization of the poor, which
Yes.
was this Protestant idea, that's one strain of Protestant idea, that if you're poor, somehow you're not in God's favor,
Yes.
that you did something wrong, you're not in favor in God's eyes, and therefore people have the right to demonize
Correct.
and even to punish. I think we really need to bear down on that and
I agree.
understand that this mean spiritedness. I read a book about Lincoln several years ago, and when I read this particular book, I read a lot that I had already read about it, but a lot of it I saw in this one book. I think it was a Betzloff's book, about how much of the conversation about slavery before the Civil War was about the Bible. Some people saying, well, there were slaves in the Bible, and God talked about do this with your slaves or do that with your slaves. And others who said, if you're really following the Bible, you cannot have slaves.
Correct.
And I think that what's so important at that time is whereas the slave owners tried to use the Bible to justify slave ownership, those who disagreed on a biblical basis did not remain quiet.
That's right.
And that's why I think what you're doing is so important. But once again, it goes way beyond just abortion to me. It's about an entire way of looking at America.
Yes.
And yeah, you were talking before about be good to the stranger, for you were a stranger and I was, so was you. You were a stranger in the land of Egypt. To heal the sick, to help the poor, to take care of the widow, to be a peacemaker. What is happening? Do you feel that there's a progressive, Christ-centered conversation, not only yours, also Talarico's and others, that really is growing up now and will be able to be an antidote to this Christian nationalist perspective that you and I would agree has nothing to do with following the teachings of Jesus?
I pray you're right. I pray you're right. I want to be a part of that, and that's why I wrote this book, because I was so tired of seeing my mom and dad's religion being used as a cover for cruelty and meanness. I was on CNN a couple of weeks ago with our old pal Scott Jennings, and he was going off on the illegals. I don't call them illegals. I call them Christian refugees.
There's no
And
such thing.
I don't argue that countries shouldn't have regulations about who comes in. It's the criminalization of migrants and refugees, calling them illegals. I've never seen anyone on Fox News call a white lawbreaker an illegal. And they come over here because of the giant help wanted sign at our border, but none of these folks want to demonize the white folks who do all the hiring that draws them across the border. And I said to Mr. Jennings, the God of the Old Testament commands us to welcome the stranger and treat the alien as one of our own and never mistreat the alien. Jesus goes one step further in Matthew 25, gathers individuals and nations and says individuals and nations will be judged, heaven or hell, by how they welcome the stranger. And I said, so why should I listen to you and Donald Trump and reject God and Jesus?
What did he say?
He didn't say anything. He had no, you know what he said? He said, we're not a theocracy. But the point is, you're legislating against the commandments
Absolutely.
of
As
the
a
God
theocracy.
you wave around like a prop to gain earthly
Yeah.
power. So we don't need to fight them. We don't need to hate them. But they should have to argue against God. Don't argue with them. Make them argue against Jesus. Make them argue against that book they use to justify so much cruelty. And if they're saying it's in the Bible somewhere, I say Christians aren't supposed to follow the Bible. They're supposed to follow Christ. The Bible commands you to kill adulterers in Leviticus 20:10. Let's see you bring some rocks over to Trump's house. They don't
Yeah.
follow it either. It's
Yeah.
not a sin and it's not hate to call out this selective application of Scripture and hypocrisy.
You know, when I was growing up, both Catholics and Jews were such an important part of any true stand for social justice. Whenever there was anything that was anti-poverty, whenever there was anything a true stand for justice, you could always count on the Catholics and you could always count on the Jews.
Yeah.
At around the same time, when you were talking about the historical arc here, 70s, 80s, etc., at about the same time, institutional Catholicism and institutional Judaism sort of separated from the main stance for social justice into the single vision. The Catholics about abortion and the Jews about Israel. And I think that sucked a lot of energy out of the great social justice movement,
Yeah.
because as long as they were there, well, the Catholics will always be with us and the Jews will always be with us.
Yeah.
Now, you brought up something now in talking to us about Scott Jennings. I want to mention a couple things about him. First of all, by talking about it in terms of white supremacy. Clearly, when we look at this political gestalt that has risen up and that is so much behind what's happening, there are several factors. There's the Peter Thiel, there's the Curtis Yarvin, there's the Christian nationalism, and also clearly it's white supremacists.
And the year 2045 is guiding a lot of what we're living through right now.
Say it again?
The year 2045, when Caucasians are projected to become a minority population, is what's driving a lot of what we're seeing right now, because the majority of undocumented immigrants are people who overstay their visas. There's like 20 to 30,000 Irish in this country. They're not trying to get the Irish out. They're not trying to get the Russians out. They're trying to get a very specific kind of immigrant out, the kind that Donald Trump has hired off the books since the 1980s to avoid paying an American worker a living wage. You know, again, not saying that countries shouldn't have standards and requirements on who comes in, but this is so steeped in racism.
It's so
There's a
clear.
gigantic help wanted sign in our border. And they'll never go out. Whenever they raid a meatpacking plant and they say they arrested 300 illegals inside, they never talk about arresting the white guys in the back counting all the money. This is the racket they have. When Donald Trump came out and said that undocumented immigrants in the agricultural sector are going to be protected, there's the lie. We have always had this economy propped up by marginalized labor, usually brown-skinned, going back to slavery, going back to the Chinese who had to build the railroads, going to the people overseas we export our slavery to now to build our gadgets. So, you know, if you're going to brag that you're so Christian, you don't get to say we have to drive out the illegals at the same time. God and Jesus are unambiguous about this issue. And it's the Democratic Party that's been too cowardly to invoke the scripture because they're afraid that they're going to be called too kind to immigrants. And it's the media, time and time again, that refuses to ask any difficult follow-up questions of conservative politicians. You know, you know this, Marianne. They'll never ask Mike Pence, where did Jesus drive the gay wedding cakes out of the temple? They'll never do it. They'll never say, where does Christ ban abortion or tell you to persecute trans kids? They'll never ask where it's in the Holy Book, and Democrats are afraid to ask it, so it's going to be up to the rest of us.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned Scott Jennings, because he displays a phenomenon that we see in a lot of people these days. I used to think of him as a moderate conservative, who represented moderate conservative values on television, and he took this hard right turn. I mean, I don't understand some of these people. I mean, look at what happened to Marco
Really?
Rubio.
You don't
Yeah.
understand? There's one
Tell,
right wing.
tell me how you see
Yeah,
this
right
having
wing.
happened. I mean, if you look at someone like Marco Rubio, for instance, and I do believe in when Eisenhower said the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative.
I agree with that too.
There are high-minded conservative as well as high-minded liberal values. I used to listen to Marco Rubio. I can't remember really, maybe 5% of the time, maybe I would agree with him about something. But I thought of him as a principled conservative. What turned all these people into Trump sycophants and hard right? What happened
It's
to America?
earthly power, Marianne. Earthly power. That's it. That's what Christian nationalism is all about. That's what fundamentalism is all about. It's not about the teachings of the holy books. It's about we're better, God likes us more, and that's why we must be in power because that's God's plan. It's a really convenient kind of
Yeah,
spiritual narcissism.
I think a lot of people need to understand about what is it called, the five mountains or the seven
Seven mountains.
mountains?
Seven mountains.
Yeah, everybody, I want to be really clear about
Seven
this.
mountain mandate.
So the seven mountain mandate, as a Jew, I find this one particularly terrifying.
Horrifying.
The seven mountain mandate, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, is the idea among Christian nationalists that these seven sectors of American society must only be led by Christians.
Only. Government,
And that
government, media, education,
right.
military, I believe the family system. Yeah, and it's their narrow right-wing version. Because again, they don't actually fight for anything Christ talked about. When Donald Trump seduced the evangelicals, you remember how he did it. He didn't promise them that I'm going to fight for the things our Lord commands. He didn't say, I'm going to do what Jesus says. I'm going to fight for the... No, he promised them power. He said, he did the persecution narrative that they do all the time, that you guys have been at Christianity's under siege, and when I'm president, you'll be in top bigly. He promised them earthly power. That is what they fight for. When you're a fundamentalist, and I outline this in the book, it doesn't matter the religion. There's five basic beliefs, I think, that unite all fundamentalists. Because I think fundamentalist Christians have more in common with fundamentalist Muslims than they do with moderate and liberal Christians.
Well, and fundamentalist Jews as well. I mean, it's
amen.
a shadow side of every group of people. Fundamentalists, anything.
Hindus too,
Yeah.
probably Scientologists. Women are always second-class citizens. The more right-wing your sect of your religion is, doesn't matter the religion. Women
Yeah.
are always second-class. Sex is bad unless it's for procreation. Women and gay people can't be doing that. Violence is okay if my side does it because God has my back. There's always a focus on punishment, not healing, in fundamentalism. And finally, the persecution narrative that justifies anything we do because something bad was done to us. This unites far right wing, Judaism, Islam, Christianity. And I'm saying you don't even need to believe in Jesus as literal fact to use him against these people because this is their camouflage. And I don't want to hurt them. I just want to take their camouflage away by reminding people what Jesus actually stood for, and they can find a new name for their crappy, mean religion.
You know, everybody, I think I heard James Talarico said this. And if it wasn't James Talarico, it was someone. It was something about the Texas legislature and a Jew in Texas who has a pretty high up role in the legislature there, and how a Christian legislator stood up and said, "You are illegitimate in this role because you are not a Christian."
Yes.
And that's why I was saying this is not just an attack on the teachings of Jesus. It is an attack on the U.S. Constitution. And it is absolutely intended to disregard a system of such radical freedom, because that's what our Constitution represents: radical freedom. That it do whatever you want to do, be whatever you want to be, pray however you want to pray, don't pray if you want to pray, as long as you don't hurt anyone else. And that very idea is anathema to that fundamentalist supremacist, whether it's Christian supremacy, Jewish supremacy, Muslim supremacy, white supremacy, which is really the problem here. And I think, John, you know, I appreciate how in this book you do talk so much about Jesus and the teachings of Christ. But I think it's significant for us to realize that this is counter to the great spiritual values that all the great
Correct.
religious and spiritual teachings of our time. So
Amen.
how do we, so I know for yourself, do you feel as someone, obviously as a progressive voice with your radio program and so forth, has this, I'm wondering what's going on inside you. I mean, I think this is a time of profound recalibration as all of us are really processing what is happening in this country. And part of this processing is each of us asking, how can I best serve? Has this changed any of your focus and where you feel you might be of greatest service? Are you feeling yourself called more? I mean, I guess the answer to some extent is yes, because you wrote this. By the way, I want to say something, and I want everybody to hear this. Several years ago, I don't know if it was at a Sister Giant, if it was at a results conference, it would have been maybe 20 years ago, John. You made a film about poverty in America.
Yes.
What was that called?
That was called Dream On, which I did for PBS a couple years back. We followed the journey of de Tocqueville when he came to America in 1830 and wrote Democracy in America, and we went to all the same cities he went to 200 years later to talk to people from billionaires to homeless shelters about the American dream. And it was a profoundly spiritual experience for me to spend several months on the road making this low-budget PBS film. And we did 55 cities in 17 states, and it was a real thrill to screen it at Sister Giant, Marianne.
It meant so much to me. It meant so much to me. So I want to make sure that we had mentioned that earlier. I wasn't sure that was the exact same film.
You're so kind, yes.
That's not just kindness. That's truth, how that affected me. So where we are now, because I think that there is a lot on the left now of identifying the problem, but we need to do more than identify the problem. We need to do more than stir the soup. We need to move the needle. We need to figure out what to do now. And obviously there are, whether it has to do with the judges standing firm, Prop 50 in California, some of the things people like Pritzker are talking about now, the mayor of Chicago. So on the external level, there are some things happening that I think any of us can see, okay, I need to support that. But I agree with you that some of this has to do with understanding, a deeper understanding of what is going on here. So
yes.
How has this in any way recalibrated for you how you see the messages that you put forth, which in this case would obviously have nothing to do with changing them, but are you feeling any more like, I want to talk about the religious stuff more? Or are you feeling, I mean, what's going on for you with
I
what's
think
happening in America today?
we're all still fighting. I think we're all still fighting for the same things we've always fought for, and we've realized the urgency in it, that this many Americans can see cops beaten for a lie and decide that that's not a deal breaker. And that, wow, maybe we aren't better than this, as we've told ourselves for a long time. And every night, Marianne, I have so many progressives call my show, and so many are fired up, and so many are so disillusioned. This is not the America they thought they were in. They've always thought we were better than this, etc. I've had to remind people, it was worse in the Civil War. It was worse in World War II. We've faced things like this before, not existential threats from our own presidency, but I would remind people there's still more of us. Vice President Harris was in the race for 100 days and still got more votes than Ronald Reagan got both times, Bill Clinton got both times, or Barack Obama got both times. Donald Trump has never cracked 50% in a presidential race. The majority of voters who've shown up the last 3 times have shown up to vote against him. There is no mandate, and the media has not pushed this message. So it's up to the rest of us to remind each other we need to be calm on this, to remember that a lot of folks show up to vote because Trump from the TV's on the ballot, and they don't show up in 2018 or 2022 when he's not on the ballot, and that's why we have to make very sure these midterms have credibility, that they aren't trifled with, that they're not going to be stolen. And I do think that Donald Trump's going to do a lot to drive voter turnout. I don't know if he will still be president when the midterms come, but I think that we may be in a situation where it has to get worse before it has to get better. A lot of Germans had to see Berlin in rubble before they could finally admit the Fuhrer had lied to them. And if you'll remember, 20 years ago, people like you and me were being called America haters. We were being called freedom haters and terrorist lovers because we said this war in Iraq is a bad idea and Bush and Cheney's economic plans are going to destroy the country. They hated us and despised us. And now, 20 years later, try finding a right-winger who will defend Bush and Cheney. In 20 years, most of these folks will deny they ever voted for Donald Trump. We have to be strong, and if you're feeling weak, find someone weaker than you and be strong for them.
And I also think for those of us on the left who, I think a lot of people on the right have really resented what felt to them like derision shown to them for their religious faith from people on the left. And I know just even on the left, how that feels to be treated like, oh, that kind of conversation isn't sophisticated, when I think that that conversation is so foundational and important for us right now. Aren't you concerned, John, though, that the president signed an executive order just yesterday prohibiting mail-in ballots, saying that people are going
Yeah.
to have IDs at
Yeah.
the
It's all
polling
illegal.
station,
He can't do
with
it.
this,
It's all illegal.
well, but he can, because that's the power of the executive order, and also it's increasingly obvious that Donald Trump doesn't care if something's illegal.
Correct. Nor do the
And
Republicans nor do the Republicans who enable him.
right, and
I mean, again,
unfortunately,
beating cops for a lie is acceptable.
yeah. Well, if he
You
continues
know,
to militarize these cities, which clearly he intends to do, my concern is about soldiers standing at the polling place and a
me
lot
too.
of people feeling too intimidated to even show up to vote. So I
Oh,
think
I'm
I think if you're going to
I'm
go
more
back to
scared
the
in the short term.
yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
right,
I'm
right,
more scared
exactly.
of
In the
someone
long
throwing
term,
someone throwing a rock at a National Guardsman. I mean, Trump signed this ridiculous, illegal, stupid flag burning amendment that doesn't change any laws. He did it because he wants people to burn flags to protest him, so they could have those images on the news at night. He did
right,
it to
right,
encourage flag burning.
yeah,
And
and
so
also
I mean,
Pete.
I'm worried. Go ahead, please.
Well, also, Pete Hegseth is drawing up plans over at the Department of Defense for a military
That's right.
group that would be sent in to squash what you and I would see as legal
Yeah.
domestic protests.
And this is why I won't let myself hate our MAGA brothers and sisters. I've been wrong about things in the past, and I get it, but I will tell the truth about the policies and leaders, and I won't soft soap it for the sake of politeness. They have, look, again, I'm fighting for love. And if you're going to stand in my country and claim that you're fighting for Jesus while you persecute migrants, while you execute sinners, while you make the poor poorer and make the rich richer, your First Amendment gives you a right to twist Scripture and pretend that this cruelty is of Christ. My First Amendment gives me the right to call you out for it and ask you, where does your holy book actually say this? And the media is never going to hold these people to account. The media, as when I was a kid watching Pat Robertson and Falwell, the media will put these charlatans on the air. I mean, look, Joel Osteen, he's not a Christian nationalist. He's not a bigot. He's not a
No,
racist.
no.
But that prosperity gospel is the same kind of junk theology that Jerry Falwell peddled. If you're poor, it's because you're spiritually deficient. If you're rich, it's because God thinks you're swell. Well, guess what? Jesus never in the Bible
Well,
anywhere
does
says material
Joel
riches will
Osteen
come
say
from good
that?
deeds. Yeah,
Wait a
that's
minute.
the
Does
prosperity
Joel Osteen
gospel.
say that?
That's the prosperity gospel, Marianne. That these rewards are a blessing to you for being such a good Christian in this life. And that sounds nice until you consider what's the flip side of that? You're essentially saying those who are suffering are
Yeah.
somehow spiritually deficient. And Jesus of the Bible, the God of the Bible, never says you will get tons of material goods in exchange for being devout. It's junk theology. It's when Falwell would say, oh, these poor people that are bums. I mean, you're blaming the poor by saying they're spiritually deficient. That does hurt us. Again, he's
Yeah.
not a racist. He's not a nationalist.
No, I've never heard Joel Osteen the way you do, but I think there are other issues
The
where
prosperity gospel.
yeah. Well, some of that goes into a different conversation, because a lot of that comes from people who say this has nothing to do with which group. It has to do with God's favor for prosperity and abundance being on all beings. But
Well, I believe that too. I just don't
yeah,
believe that you get special treatment from God and material riches because you're so special.
no,
There's nothing in the scriptures that tells us that.
and
It's a
that goes
very
all the way back.
it's a very seductive message for megachurch
Right.
pastors who hide hundreds of thousands of dollars on the walls. I mean, they make a lot of money off of this. You don't make a lot of money off of saying the things Jesus said about how you are called to serve the poor, and he says it in Matthew 25. Jesus gives his requirements for what a Christian nation would be. He says individual nations will be judged by how you care for the poor, how you care for the sick, how you welcome the stranger, and are you kind to those in prison? Do you visit people in prison? That's it. Nothing about how much money you give your church or how much you yell at women outside clinics. Jesus says what it would take. So try finding a right-wing Christian who'll put that quote on the side of a courtroom or a classroom. Again, if they're going to claim this is Christian, you guys have a right to call them out when it's not of Jesus. They use this to advance cruelty. They did this with slavery. And they use I talk about it in the book at length, the story of Ham, this bastardization of the Noah story, to say that God approves of slavery, even though Jesus said he came to break the chains. And it was Christ's followers, like Harriet Tubman, like the Quakers, like Frederick Douglass, who called them out. Segregation, you mentioned it. The Christians propped it up. They said, oh, Tower of Babel, separation of the nations. It was a Baptist minister named Dr. King and his many Christian and non-Christian allies who pushed back against this as well. The labor movement, it was Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement who helped put an end to child labor and give us a weekend. All throughout history, we have seen this toxic religion that calls itself Christianity but is really authoritarianism. And we've seen the true followers of Jesus, not all of whom are Christians, many Jews, many atheists, many allies of these Christ followers who've been there along the way, who've had to push back against the batshit Christians.
And not only because they are followers of Jesus, but followers of the tenets, the universal tenets of their own religions.
Yes.
Justice, thou
Yes.
shalt pursue.
Yes.
Well, I think you're great.
Thank
I
you.
think everybody, I hope that you'll get the book, Separation of Church and Hate. And more than anything, I hope that you'll take very seriously the notion that we must stand up for our spiritual and religious values
Amen.
within the public sphere these days. We cannot be quiet right now. This is not a moment to say, well, I keep my stuff, kind of private. Not when people are being thrown into concentration camps or ripped apart from their children and their families.
And the hardest part is we can't hate them. We have to hate what they're doing, but we can't hate them. These people aren't nationalists. They're our neighbors.
But they would say that about us, too.
I know. But they have no problem hating us. And they never have. And we got to be the ones who turn the other cheek. We got to model turning the other cheek, because I'm willing to take a punch to help other people. We have to. The only thing that's going to save America is love. Love for America and love from America.
And for Americans.
And for Americans, and from
For
Americans.
Americans. We don't always have to agree, everybody. And I think that's such an important issue. We can agree to disagree. Okay, much love to all of you. Anything else, John, you want to add?
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Marianne. I do a show
Thank
every
you.
night on Sirius XM Progress. You can hear it the next day as a free podcast, the John Fugelsang podcast. And my book is on sale now. Thank you all so much for having me.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, John.
Peace.